to come back to, some of the references about, kind of corporeal feminism, embodied feminist thinking, and so on, theorizing from kind of the perspective of women and so on. One of the things I've wrestled with in my own thinking has been when I argue very strongly, as I have throughout my career, for the inclusion of women in engineering programs and computer science and so on. And more recently, I've been arguing for the inclusion of women on design teams. And so I stop and I think I'm now falling into a really biologically essentialist position. And that where it comes up short is when you understand time after time that, again, mere presence or the fact that you've let them in doesn't necessarily mean that things will be done differently. And so I kind of wrestle with this notion of just letting women in, inviting them in, making it available for them to be there, hiring them on the design team doesn't necessarily mean that what will happen from their work, from the products of the collaboration, the thinking, doesn't mean that it will be different. Because if it were so simple, it would just be, it's just, just add women and stir. It's very much about how I've been socialized, how I myself have practices of femininity, how the system, how I perform my gender identity, how the system recognizes it, right? I can say the exact same thing that a man says in a meeting and have it not be picked up because it comes from a body that has certain kinds of feminine qualities. It has nothing to do with the essence of my biology or so on. It's all about the way in which everything is organized to see one set of bodies doing one thing in one way and another set of bodies doing something else. So the struggle, and what I guess the question I'm parachuting to is, what do we do about the question of biological essentialism?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right at one level, but I also think that it's not an argument against things like affirmative action. I mean, I suppose the thing that comes up and is discussed quite a lot in Britain at the moment is the sort of Norwegian experiment where actually the state says, by this year you have to have this many women on your management boards, and that they just went ahead as a state and legislated, and there was kicking and screaming about it, and there aren't good enough women, and da-da-da-da-da. And actually the Norwegian economy hasn't collapsed. And there's been in Britain, I mean, again, I'm sorry, I don't know the current state here, but I mean, in Britain, there's been reports the last few years about the lack of senior women managers. And of course, they don't believe in affirmative action. But it seems like the number of women managers isn't increasing, even though, and I'm a great believer still in some state, if regulation's too strong, at least some incentives, that some incentives to increase the number of women and all these things. And the reason I think that is that there is quite a lot of evidence that if you have more than token women, and I mean, I agree with you that the problem is having very few women and they're vulnerable, but actually, if you look on the whole at organisations where there's quite a lot of women, and over time, you find that women's positions in those organisations is better. That there is enough organisational work to show that if you get enough women in and it becomes normalised over time.
It's about a culture shift. It's not that anyone in particular, because of a set of endowments, genetic endowments, is going to change things, but that it accumulates. How might we think about some of these, kind of long-standing issues of labor, technology, equality, in light of the kind of new identities that people are embracing in the ways that maybe a second wave feminist would have embraced.
In old-fashioned terms, one might say that the cultural changes have been enormous. I feel very optimistic at some level about those kind of cultural shifts, if I can still talk about them as kind of cultural. But I mean, they don't translate very easily into great gains in terms of the labour market, if I can make that kind of division, and I know I kind of shouldn't. So we'd made a lot of gains in terms of those things. And I think the recession, and it's actually a depression in Britain. It's not. I mean, in a lot of countries in Europe, it's actually a big depression, not a recession. Actually means that a lot of these gains have been lost, actually, and that I'm not sure. And so we've got this odd. We're in this sort of odd historical period, and we're all trying to think about how to kind of theorise it, where, we've still got these progressive cultural attitudes at some level, but we've got an economy shifting back to a very sort of unequal, marketised, kind of cruel work condition, work conditions. And there's a lot of discussion within sociology and everywhere about whether the second half of the 20th century was a kind of aberration, whether actually we're just in some blip and things are going to kind of go back, or whether actually, historically we had this sort of period, this sort of post-war boom and a lot of gains in various things in terms of kind of equality, certainly in the kind of global north, and whether actually whether the state is ever going to be able to sort of reconstruct that, or whether this is actually being deconstructed for real.